Hi, we're in Toquerville, Utah right now. Uh, this is a small town in southwestern Utah, part of the Tri-City areas of Toquerville, LaVerkin, and Hurricane. The Toquerville post office is behind me. It's an historic post office. One of the interesting facts about Toquerville is that when Brigham Young sent the pioneers down here to settle this area of the Hurricane Valley, it was a few decades after the visit of the famous Alexis de Tocqueville, who came to the United States and wrote about his impressions of the United States. Well, when the pioneers came down here, because of their problems with toking, they ended up calling this Toquerville by accident, and the name is stuck. Behind me is the Hercules Plateau. It's called the Hercules Plateau because the Hercules Aerospace Company tested rockets back during the 1960s and 70s when they were preparing for the Apollo space mission and getting NASA off the ground, so to speak. Some of the locals, the younger locals, think it's named after the god, the demigod Hercules, who came and visited there, but it's not the case because he doesn't really exist. What does exist, though, is this Herculean task that NASA put forward to be able to get man into space and eventually to the moon. One of the more interesting stories of what happened during the 1960s during a rocket test is that they were visited by aliens here. Some of the old timers report that the aliens were interested in helping us with our space program, but not too much, because they looked at us as being too primitive. Hopefully we're doing better in the ensuing 50 years since they visited. I'm standing right here at the confluence of Ash Creek, LaVerkin Creek, and the Virgin River. Now, the LaVerkin is the town that we're in right now. It was named after the Virgin River. The Spanish named this river earlier when they had explored and marketed and traded with Indians in this area and done some mining. And they called this river LaVerkin. And when the Mormons came down here, they heard LaVerkin as LaVerkin. In the last few decades, however, the LaVerkinites have shifted the vowel sound of LaVerkin, in LaVerkin there, to be LaVerkin. And so a lot of LaVerkinites say LaVerkin instead of LaVerkin. This behind me, the Virgin River Gorge, houses an old powerhouse where they did generate some electricity for the early pioneers before the light bulb was invented, which is an interesting thing because, like the elevator shafts in the Salt Lake Temple, this was another thing that the pioneers were way ahead of their time in. And, they just really knew what they were doing. Behind me is the LaVerkin Bridge, which spans the Virgin River. This bridge is notable because back in 1982, during the filming of the movie For Your Eyes Only, based on the James Bond character by Ian Fleming, by the way, who visited here several times and especially liked this bridge, there was a scene where a plane was flown underneath the bridge in a stunt and was quite an exciting moment. The LaVerkinites are especially proud of their moment in film. The H on the ridge on the east side of Hurricane is one of the first, in fact, the first letter that was put on a mountain here in Utah to celebrate a high school or a town. The town of Hurricane. Behind me is the home of the Tigers of Hurricane. It's an especially important school because it's the first high school in southern Utah that chose the tiger as the mascot. This was because tigers became loose when the Barnum and Bailey Circus came here and actually killed 3 elementary school children in 1913. Ever since then, they've celebrated the tiger because those children were especially badly behaved. The other thing that people don't know, a lot of people don't know in Hurricane, is why Hurricane or Hurricane is named Hurricane. Some people think it's because on that same ridge we were looking at earlier that Adam and Eve were walking along, and Cain with their children Abel and Cain was always lagging behind, and so they would say Hurricane. A lot of old timers like to say that one. They believe it, but they also think it's a joke. But really the story is when the settlers first came here, there was a huge storm, and they believed that they had arrived at the Pacific Ocean and believed that there was a hurricane that actually was hitting this area at the time. But when the storm cleared, it turned out that it wasn't. It was just a big, rainy windstorm. But the name stuck. The last part of this is a lot of people will correct you if you say hurricane for this town. They'll say it's hurricane, and that's partly correct. But the only reason is because the early settlers here had a genetically caused speech impediment, which prevented them from saying the long A sound. And so instead they would say in hurricane. I'm standing in front of Quail Lake Dam. The Quail Lake Dam that creates the reservoir that it dams up on Quail Creek was built first in the 1980s. A lot of the old timers here saw the materials that they were making the dam out of and were worried that the dam would break, which it did because they made it out of just the sandy soil that was in the area. The old timers said, you need to put concrete in that, and the state didn't really listen to the old timers, and it turns out the old timers were right. The dam broke and washed down all the way through the valley down there and all the way into St. George, where it destroyed or damaged, did a lot of water damage to the St. George Tabernacle. Since then, after the cleanup, and they're actually still building the St. George Tabernacle this day, being November of 2016. But they did rebuild the dam, and they followed the old timers' instructions this second time. And as you can see, it's made a lot of concrete, and it's done a good job of holding back the creek. I said creek earlier, but I was wrong. I meant creek. Here we are in St. George at the location of the St. George Tabernacle. And the tabernacle was built in 1851 when the pioneers came down here and Brigham Young ordered to be built. He chose 1851 because that matched the number of wives he had at the time. In 1983, when the Quail Creek Dam broke and washed out the tabernacle was not at this location. It was further down in the valley. After it was washed out and it had sustained all this water damage, the church decided to move the tabernacle up to this location closer to the temple. They attached, in commemoration to Brigham Young and his wives in the year 1851, 51 hot air balloons to lift it into the air and across the city of St. George until it came here, where they're finishing up the final bits of renovation.